I've always believed that family was worth every sacrifice. That belief was carved into me like the grain of oak in the workbench I'd used for 40 years. You take care of your own. That's what my father taught me, whether they deserve it or not. For most of my life, that principle had served me well. It kept my daughter close when she was young, kept my conscience clean when I couldn't give her everything she wanted. It's what pushed me to work 12-hour days in my metalwork shop, shaping steel in the dead of winter with a space heater that barely worked, just so she could have a warm house and a decent education. But over the last decade, I learned something ugly about that kind of devotion. Sacrifice, if you're not careful, can turn into currency, and currency is something people will spend until it's gone. It started small. A down payment here, a temporary loan there. My daughter, Rebecca, had married into the Whitmore family, a name that carried weight in our town like a marble statue in the middle of the courthouse lawn. Old money, old connections, old ideas about who's worth inviting to their table. Her husband Daniel was polite enough when they were dating, nervous around me maybe, but respectful. After the wedding, I noticed how his politeness began to sound more like condescension, as if marrying into his world had elevated Rebecca beyond the reach of her working-class roots. Still, I convinced myself it was my imagination. When they bought their first house, Daniel's father, Charles Whitmore, congratulated them on the purchase as if it had been his doing. He didn't mention the $42,000 I'd taken from my retirement account to cover the down payment. That was between family, after all. The mortgage was more than they could handle. Daniel's career in business consulting never seemed to generate a steady paycheck. So I set up an automatic transfer from my account to theirs. $2,800 every month. It was supposed to be for 6 months, just until they got on their feet. That was 5 years ago. Over those 5 years, I replaced their roof. Paid for a kitchen remodel when Rebecca wanted granite countertops, like in the magazines, and covered 2 missed car payments when Daniel decided he needed a new SUV to make a better impression on his clients. Meanwhile, in my own house, the porch light flickered for months because I didn't have the spare cash to fix it. I wore the same winter coat for 8 seasons. My refrigerator made a grinding noise I learned to ignore. Every time I wanted to buy something for myself, I'd think about that mortgage transfer and put it back on the shelf. I told myself it was worth it. For Rebecca's security, for her happiness. That's what a father does. But lately, I'd started to feel the strain. It wasn't just the money. It was the way Charles Whitmore would nod politely at me during holiday gatherings, as though I were the help who'd stayed a little too long in the kitchen. It was the way his wife, Margaret, would talk about our family's success in front of a room full of people, knowing I was standing right there, invisible. Daniel picked up those habits too. He started to make little comments about our different worlds, as though they were cute quirks in our relationship. Rebecca didn't stop him. Maybe she didn't notice. Maybe she didn't want to. I might have let it all slide. The quiet disrespect, the erasure of my contributions, if it weren't for what happened last December. It was a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks before Christmas. I'd stopped by their house to drop off a set of custom cabinet handles I'd made for Rebecca. I found Daniel in the living room, leaning back in a leather armchair I'd helped pay for, staring at me like he was working up the nerve to say something unpleasant. "Thomas," he began, clearing his throat. "About Christmas this year." I set the handles on the coffee table. "What about it?" He glanced toward the kitchen, where Rebecca was arranging flowers in a crystal vase. She didn't look at me. "My parents are hosting the dinner this year," Daniel said. "They'd Prefer to keep it small, just immediate family. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. I am immediate family. Rebecca's hands froze over the vase. Daniel shifted in his chair. It's just, my parents have a certain way of doing things. They want to maintain a certain atmosphere. An atmosphere that doesn't include me? My voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it that made him look down. Rebecca finally spoke, her voice low. It's complicated, Dad. They're used to a different kind of conversation at the table. Politics, art, literature. I almost laughed. And you're telling me I wouldn't be able to keep up? Daniel tried to soften it with a smile. It's not about that. It's just, it's about where I come from, I said. It's about the fact that I work with my hands instead of signing papers all day. It's about the fact that I don't summer in the Hamptons. Neither of them denied it. I looked around the room, at the hardwood floors I'd paid for, the crown molding I'd installed, the curtains Rebecca had chosen after I'd covered the bill. Every corner of that house had a piece of me in it, but I was no longer welcome inside when it mattered most. I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch. Well, I said, reaching for my coat. If I'm not welcome at your table, I won't force my way in. Dad, wait! Rebecca started, but I was already at the door. Outside, the December air cut into me like cold steel. I stood on their porch for a moment, looking out at the neighborhood, the neatly trimmed lawns, the glowing Christmas lights, the perfect suburban picture that my money had helped create. It hit me then, clear as a hammer strike. I'd been financing my own exclusion. When I climbed into my truck, I didn't start it right away. I just sat there, hands on the wheel, feeling the weight of every dollar, every hour, every sacrifice that had led to this moment. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel proud of what I'd done for my family. I felt like a fool. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows of the ceiling fan blades sliding across the plaster as the streetlight outside hummed through the window. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's face, that careful expression people use when they're telling you something insulting but hoping you'll thank them for their honesty. I saw Rebecca's hands frozen over that vase, her eyes darting anywhere but at me. By 2 in the morning, I wasn't even angry anymore. I was hollow. It's a strange thing, realizing that the people you love most don't actually see you, not as you are, but as you've always been to them. A tool, a source, a reliable current they can tap without thinking about the cost. At 4 a.m., I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. My accountant used to tell me that numbers tell stories if you're willing to listen. I decided it was time to listen. I started with the down payment, $42,000. Wrote it in neat block letters at the top. Below it, the mortgage, $2,800 a month, 60 months, $168,000. Roof replacement, $12,000. Kitchen remodel, $21,500. 2 missed car payments, $1,200. Miscellaneous. Holidays, furniture, emergencies. I conservatively pegged at another $8,000. When I added it all up, the pen hesitated before I wrote the number. $252,700. That was more than I'd made in my first 6 years running the shop. More than I had in my retirement account now. I stared at the figure until the ink blurred. Somewhere along the way, my temporary help had turned into a second life I was financing. A life I wasn't even allowed to step into for Christmas dinner. I looked around my kitchen. The fridge rattled when it cycled. The laminate countertop was peeling at the corner. My chair creaked when I shifted my weight. I'd been eating canned soup and day-old bread to keep their lives glossy. I'd been wearing patchwork jeans while Daniel wore tailored slacks to a job I wasn't even sure was real. That's when the switch flipped. It wasn't rage. Rage is noisy and messy. This was quiet. The kind of quiet you hear in a workshop before the saw blade bites into the wood. A quiet that meant I'd finally stopped making excuses. At 9:03 a.m., I called the bank. The woman on the other end sounded chipper, like she'd already had 3 cups of coffee. First National Bank, this is Jennifer. How can I help you? I need to cancel an automatic transfer, I said. My voice was steady, even pleasant. Certainly, I'll just need your account number and some verification. I read off the numbers, answered her security questions, and listened to the clack of her keyboard. All right, she said after a pause. I see the transfer, $2,800 monthly to a joint account under Rebecca and Daniel Whitmore. How long have you been making this transfer? 5 years, I said. The words came out like I was spitting out something sour. And you'd like to cancel it effective immediately? Yes. Another pause. Done. The transfer has been canceled. Is there anything else I can help you with? No, I said, and then, because it felt good, no, that's everything. When I hung up, the kitchen was still the same. The fridge still rattled, the countertop was still peeling, but the air felt lighter. For the first time in years, I wasn't watching money drain from my account into a life that didn't want me in it. By lunchtime, I'd already gotten 2 missed calls from Rebecca. I didn't answer. At 3 p.m., Daniel called. I let it go to voicemail. His voice was sharp, tight with forced politeness. Thomas, hey, just wanted to check in. Rebecca said the mortgage payment didn't come through. Maybe it's a bank error? Call me back. I didn't. At 6, the calls stopped. That told me they'd figured out it wasn't a mistake. I made myself a steak for dinner, first one in months, and opened a bottle of Merlot I'd been saving. I ate slowly, savoring every bite, the sound of my fork on the plate louder than it had any right to be in that quiet house. That's when the knock came. It wasn't Rebecca or Daniel. It was Charles Whitmore himself, standing on my porch in a camel hair coat that probably cost more than my truck. He smiled the way people do when they're about to give you bad news they think you're too stupid to see coming. Thomas, he said, his voice dripping with practiced charm. Mind if I come in? I didn't move from the doorway. What do you want, Charles? He held his hands up like he was making peace. I just think we should talk. Man to man. About? Well, it seems there's been a disruption in the mortgage payments. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. Daniel's under a lot of pressure at work. Rebecca's busy with the kids. There is no misunderstanding, I said. I canceled the payments. His smile thinned, but he didn't drop it completely. That's surprising. You've always been so supportive. Supportive is one thing, subsidizing is another. He chuckled, like I'd made a joke. Look, I know we've had our differences, but the house, their stability, depends on you. I'd hate to see things get complicated for them. The way he said complicated told me exactly what he meant. Threats, leverage, pressure. The Whitmores were used to getting their way, and they thought I was just another pawn on their board. I leaned against the door frame. Here's the thing, Charles. For 5 years, I've been paying for your son's life while you've been playing King of the Hill. I've eaten canned soup so they could drink imported wine. And for what? So you can tell me I'm not good enough to sit at the same table? His eyes narrowed. Now, Thomas, no one said, yes, you did. Maybe not in those words, but you made damn sure I got the message. The smile was gone now. You'll regret this. I opened the door wider, not as an invitation, but as a dismissal. We'll see. He stepped back, his shoes crunching on the gravel. For a moment, I thought he might say more, but instead he turned and walked toward his black sedan. I closed the door, slid the deadbolt into place, and went back to my steak. It was cold now, but it still tasted like victory. When Charles Whitmore left my porch that night, I thought I'd bought myself some quiet. I was wrong. The next morning, the phone started ringing before I'd even poured my coffee. Rebecca first, her voice tight, brittle. "Dad, Daniel says you canceled the mortgage payment. Is that true?" "Yes." "Why?" she demanded, like I'd just switched off her life support. "Because I've been making that payment for 5 years, Rebecca. It was supposed to be temporary." "We agreed." "No," I cut in. "We didn't agree. You asked." I said yes. "That's not an agreement. That's me giving, and you taking." She went quiet, but I could hear her breathing, sharp little puffs of frustration. "You're punishing us. For Christmas." I almost laughed. "No. Christmas was just the reminder I needed." "Dad, you don't understand how much pressure we're under." "I understand exactly. You're under pressure to keep living a life you can't afford without my wallet propping it up. And I'm done propping." I hung up before she could answer. I expected Daniel to call next, but instead it was a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened later, it was Charles, his voice all smooth diplomacy again. "Thomas, we really ought to resolve this like gentlemen. Call me back." I didn't. By noon, I'd had enough of sitting around waiting for their next move. I needed air. I drove out to the shop, my shop, even though I'd been semi-retired for years. The place still smelled of sawdust and oil, the two scents that had built my life. There's something about walking into a space that's truly yours. No one can take it from you. No one can rewrite the story of how it came to be. I'd started in that building when I was 23, with a used drill press, a rented lathe, and a ledger that barely had more black than red. Over 4 decades, I'd turned it into a steady business that had put food on my table, sent my daughter to college, and given me a name people in this town trusted. The Whitmores couldn't touch that. I sat at my old workbench and opened the metal cash box where I kept things that mattered. Not money, not anymore, but papers, receipts, contracts. Little slips of proof that I'd existed in more ways than the Whitmores liked to pretend. I pulled out a manila folder and started filling it. Not for the bank, not for a lawyer, not yet. But for me. Down payment documents. The cashier's check copy for $42,000 with my name and Rebecca's scrawled signature. Bank statements showing the automatic transfer. $2,800 every month. Like clockwork. Invoices from the roofing company, the contractor for the kitchen remodel, the landscaping crew that had transformed their backyard into something fit for a magazine spread. I even printed screenshots from Rebecca's social media. Our beautiful new kitchen, with her posing in front of the granite countertops I'd paid for. Photos of them sipping wine in Napa while I was eating reheated chili from a can. By the time I was done, the folder was thick, heavy, tangible proof of 5 years of generosity that had been taken for granted. And as I flipped through it, something inside me settled. This wasn't about getting the money back. I knew I never would. This was about taking control of the story before they wrote me into the villain role. I didn't know exactly how I'd use it yet, but I knew I would. On my way home, I stopped at the grocery store, not because I needed much, just coffee and a few things for dinner, but because I wanted to see people who didn't look at me like I was either a walking bank account or an inconvenience. Mrs. Callahan, who'd run the register there for 30 years, smiled when she saw me. "Thomas, haven't seen you in a while." "Been keeping busy," I said. "You look good." "Rested." I smiled back. I feel good. She didn't know it, but she was right. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying someone else's mortgage in my pocket like a stone dragging me down. When I got home, there was a letter in the mailbox. Handwritten. No return address. I opened it at the kitchen table, my coffee steaming beside me. It was from Charles. Thomas, I'm sorry our last conversation was tense. I value our family connection, and I'd like to keep things cordial. That said, Rebecca and Daniel are facing a difficult time. I trust you'll reconsider your decision. It would be unfortunate if this matter became public. Our community has certain expectations. Yours, Charles Whitmore. It was a threat wrapped in velvet. I set the letter down and looked out the kitchen window at my backyard. The bare trees, the frost on the grass. The winter light was thin, the kind that makes everything look sharper, more defined. I thought about the Whitmores and their community expectations. For years, I'd played by their rules. I'd stayed quiet when they cut me out of conversations, when they made jokes that landed just close enough to insult. I'd told myself it was for Rebecca's sake, but there comes a point when quiet becomes consent, and I wasn't consenting anymore. I poured the rest of my coffee down the sink, grabbed my coat, and walked out to the truck. The first act of defiance wasn't canceling the mortgage. That was survival. The first act of defiance was deciding that the next move would be mine, and it wouldn't be polite. It didn't take long for the Whitmores to make their move. 3 days after I canceled the mortgage and sent Charles home from my porch, the storm hit. Not with wind and rain, but with ink and paper. I was sitting at my kitchen table working through the crossword in the Spokane Daily Review when I turned the page and nearly dropped my coffee. There I was, not in a flattering photo. No, they'd chosen an old company headshot from a decade ago, before my hair had gone completely gray, before my shoulders had started to stoop. A picture that somehow made me look older than I am now. Above it, the headline, Local Businessman Abandons Elderly Couple at Airport During Holiday Storm. I read it twice before my brain caught up to what my eyes were seeing. The article painted a picture of poor, frail Charles and Margaret Whitmore, left stranded at Spokane International for hours after I'd failed to honor a commitment to pick them up. It talked about frigid winter conditions, even though the day in question had been a sunny 52 degrees. It quoted Charles, describing how, at our age, to be left in such circumstances without warning is both dangerous and cruel. Margaret was quoted too, her voice all faux grace. We were shocked. We simply couldn't believe that family would treat us this way, especially at Christmas. The words dangerous and cruel were repeated 3 times in the article. And then came the real dagger. A line slipped in like a casual observation. Some in the community have noticed a pattern of erratic behavior from Mr. Blake in recent years. No names attached to that little gem, just enough to plant the seed. I put the paper down and sat back, staring at the kitchen wall. This was no accident. This wasn't some reporter stumbling across a human interest story at the airport. This was planted, carefully, strategically. I'd been in this town long enough to know how it worked. A call from the right person to the right editor, a favor cashed in, a subtle promise of future access. And in the Whitmore's world, that right person was always just one martini away. I flipped back to the byline, Patricia Morrison, lifestyle editor. I didn't know her personally, but I knew her type. The kind of writer who thrived on gossip dressed up as journalism, who understood that in a small city like Spokane, Reputation wasn't just currency, it was the whole damn economy. I didn't need to guess how this had happened. Charles had made it clear in his letter. It would be unfortunate if this matter became public. Well, here it was, public, and dressed up in the ugliest wrapping paper they could find. For a long moment, I considered doing nothing. Let them have their little smear campaign. Let the whispers spread at the country club, at the Chamber of Commerce luncheons. I'd survived worse. But then I thought about the number in my ledger, $252,700. I thought about the way Daniel had looked at me when he told me I wasn't invited for Christmas. Like I was some obligation he'd finally found a way to cross off his list. I thought about Rebecca, not meeting my eyes, letting her husband's family erase me in real time. And I realized something. This wasn't about defending myself anymore. It was about taking back the narrative. I pushed the paper aside, went to my desk, and powered on my laptop. The Whitmores had made 3 critical mistakes. First, they'd underestimated me. They saw an aging metalworker, not the businessman who'd built a company from nothing and survived 40 years of competition, recessions, and bad deals. Second, they'd gone public. That meant I could go public too. And I had something far more compelling than their sob story, hard evidence. Third, they'd documented their entire gilded lives on social media, every vacation, every remodel, every champagne toast, all paid for, in part, by me. I typed their names into search bars, one by one. Charles, Margaret, Daniel, even Rebecca. Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. Every account was a goldmine. Photos of the Napa trip 2 summers ago when I'd covered their property tax bill. The Christmas morning shot of them in matching silk pajamas, standing in front of a tree I'd bought, and the gifts I'd helped pay for. The new patio furniture set they'd shown off in June, posted the same week they'd asked me to cover their car insurance. And then, there it was. The missing piece. Daniel's LinkedIn activity showed a new connection. Patricia Morrison, the lifestyle editor who'd written the hit piece on me. I almost laughed. It was too perfect. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, the plan forming in my head like blueprints on a drafting table. If the Whitmores wanted a war of reputation, I'd give them one. But I wouldn't fight it in the shadows. No. I'd fight it in their own dining room. Christmas Eve was 4 days away. According to Margaret's Facebook events, they'd be hosting 12 guests, friends, neighbors, fellow members of their precious community, the kind of people who read the Spokane Daily Review and took every word as gospel. I knew exactly when I'd make my move. But this time, I wouldn't be showing up with gifts or checks. I'd be showing up with the truth. When you've spent 40 years running a small business, you learn that the best way to win a fight is to prepare before the other guy even knows you've stepped into the ring. The Whitmores had thrown their first punch in the Daily Review. It was sloppy, dressed up with emotional manipulation, but still dangerous in a town like Spokane, where reputation has a way of sticking, whether it's earned or not. So I decided to stop thinking like a wronged father and start thinking like the businessman I used to be. That afternoon, I cleared the kitchen table and laid out my ammunition. Bank statements, 5 years' worth, each one showing the same $2,800 transfer to Rebecca and Daniel's account. I highlighted the payments in yellow, the same way I used to mark invoices that needed urgent attention. Receipts for the down payment, the roof replacement, the kitchen remodel, invoices for landscaping, utility bills, even the new water heater they'd insisted was absolutely necessary 2 winters ago. I placed them in chronological order, year by year. building a paper trail so airtight it could have been submitted as evidence in court. Then I opened my laptop and started pulling every relevant photo from their social media accounts. Rebecca's post about our dream kitchen, complete with granite countertops I'd put on my credit card. Daniel's humble brag about finally paying off the SUV, conveniently leaving out that I'd covered 2 months' payments when he was between jobs. Margaret's snapshot of the Napa Vineyard tour, taken the same month I'd written them a check to cover their property taxes. The more I compiled, the more obvious the pattern became. Luxury for them, leftovers for me. And then, just for good measure, I printed the daily review article. I read it one more time, red pen in hand, writing notes in the margins. Lie, next to the claim about freezing winter conditions. False, beside the line about my erratic behavior. Missing context. By the vague reference to family tensions. When I was finished, I had 12 identical packets, one for each dinner guest at the Whitmore's Christmas Eve party. I wasn't going to mail them. I wasn't going to leak them anonymously. That wasn't my style. No, I was going to walk into that dining room, look each person in the eye, and hand them the truth myself. It wasn't about embarrassing them in public for the sake of spectacle. It was about balance. For years, they'd operated with the assumption that I'd always be too polite, too respectable to make a scene. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. Over the next few days, I moved like a man with a secret. I kept my phone off most of the time, ignoring the handful of calls that still came through from Rebecca and Daniel. I didn't respond to the voicemail Charles left on Wednesday night, the one that sounded calm on the surface, but had a thread of panic running underneath. Instead, I focused on preparation. I had my old Navy suit dry cleaned, the one I'd worn to Maria's funeral. Not because I wanted to drape myself in grief, but because it was the sharpest suit I owned, and I wanted to look them in the eye wearing something they couldn't dismiss as working class. I polished my shoes, bought a new tie, deep red, the kind of color that said, "I'm not here by accident." I even got a haircut. Not for vanity, but because I knew every detail mattered. The Whitmores were people who judged the world by appearances. I was going to use that against them. On the morning of Christmas Eve, I sat at my desk and went through the plan one last time. Timing was key. I needed to arrive after they'd sat down to eat, when the guests were relaxed, plates full, wine glasses in hand. Leaving would mean abandoning their meal and admitting to the room that something was wrong. I also needed to control the flow of information. No shouting, no name-calling, just a calm presentation of facts, like a boardroom meeting. The quieter I was, the louder the truth would sound. At 6:30 p.m., I loaded the 12 packets into my briefcase, slipped into my suit, and drove toward Kendall Yards. The Whitmores' house was lit up like a postcard, every window glowing, the driveway lined with polished cars. From across the street, I could see shadows moving inside, the shapes of people leaning toward each other in conversation. I checked my watch. 6:45. Perfect. I stepped out of the truck, the cold air biting at my cheeks. My shoes crunched over the frost on the sidewalk. The front door was unlocked, of course. Margaret loved to boast about how safe their neighborhood was. I opened it quietly, stepping into the warm air that smelled of rosemary and garlic. Laughter drifted from the dining room, and that's when I realized I wasn't nervous. I'd been carrying this weight for 5 years. The checks, the quiet insults, the exclusion. But now, with the truth in my hand and the room just a few steps away, I felt lighter than I had in years. I walked toward the voices. Margaret was mid-sentence, telling some story about our family's tradition when she saw me. The conversation froze. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward me. Daniel's fork clinked against his plate. Rebecca's face drained of color. Charles leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady. "I hope you don't mind if I join you for a moment." I set the briefcase on the marble sideboard, unlatched it, and pulled out the first packet. "I thought your guests might appreciate knowing the real story behind this beautiful dinner, this home, and the lives you've been so eager to show off." And just like that, the game was in my hands. You could have heard a pin drop in that dining room. The Whitmores' guests sat frozen, forks hovering over plates of rosemary-crusted lamb. Wine glasses halfway to lips. The only sound was the faint clink of the chandelier swaying above the table. I let the silence sit for a moment. Silence is power, if you know how to hold it. "I brought each of you something," I said, my voice even, as though I were passing out Christmas gifts instead of a live grenade. I reached into my briefcase and handed the first packet to the woman on my right, a tall brunette in a pearl necklace who looked like she'd been born in a country club dining chair. Her eyes flicked to the cover page. Documented financial contributions to Rebecca and Daniel Whitmore, 2018-2023. I moved clockwise around the table, placing a packet in front of each guest. No one stopped me. No one said a word. When I reached Charles, I didn't give him one. I held it up instead, just long enough for him to see the bold yellow highlights bleeding through the paper. Then I placed it in front of the man sitting next to him, a banker I recognized from town, one of those pillar of the community types. Charles's jaw clenched. When I'd made my way around the table, I straightened up and clasped my hands behind my back. "For the last 5 years," I began, "I've been quietly covering your host's mortgage, $2,800 a month. That's $168,000 for those keeping track." A murmur ran through the room, but no one looked at me. They were all looking at Charles. "I also paid the $42,000 down payment on this house," I continued. "Replaced the roof, remodeled the kitchen, landscaped the yard, and covered various bills whenever the Whitmores found themselves in. Let's call it a moment of need." I took a slow step toward the head of the table. "In total, my contributions amount to $250,700. All documented, all verifiable." Rebecca's voice cracked. "Dad, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," I said. I turned to the group. "Now, you might be wondering why I'm bringing this up tonight during your holiday dinner. The answer's simple. Because last week, this family decided I wasn't fit to sit at their table. And then, they went a step further." I reached into the briefcase and pulled out the Spokane Daily Review article, holding it up so the headline was visible to the entire room. "They planted this story," I said, "a complete fabrication designed to paint me as unstable, cruel, and unreliable. That, ladies and gentlemen, is gratitude in the Whitmore household." The banker next to Charles cleared his throat. "Is this true?" he asked, his tone pointed but not yet hostile. I locked eyes with Charles. "Tell him." Charles smoothed his tie. "This is a gross misrepresentation. I cut him off. "Charles, every word you say right now is competing with the evidence in those packets, so choose carefully." Margaret, her voice all sugar, tried to step in. "Thomas, you're upsetting everyone. This isn't—" "Upsetting?" I said, my voice still calm but carrying enough weight to flatten the room. "No. Upsetting is watching the people you've supported for years turn around and erase you from their lives because you don't fit their image of refinement. Upsetting is reading lies about yourself in the paper, planted by your own family." One of the women halfway down the table, someone I didn't recognize, set her fork down. "If even half of this is true, She didn't finish the sentence. It's all true, I said, and it's all in front of you. Dates, amounts, signatures. If anyone wants to verify, I'll be more than happy to share my bank records. Unlike some people here, I have nothing to hide. Rebecca's face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. Charles leaned forward, his voice low but cutting. Do you think this makes you look noble, Thomas? Barging in here, trying to humiliate us in front of our friends? I met his stare without flinching. I'm not here to look noble. I'm here to stop letting you write the story for me. For a moment, the two of us locked eyes. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a battle for the narrative, and he knew it. Finally, I stepped back, my work here done. Merry Christmas, I said, my voice almost polite. And Charles? Next time you want to destroy someone's reputation, make sure they don't have a better case than you. I picked up my briefcase and turned toward the door. The silence behind me wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of people recalculating what they thought they knew. When I reached the foyer, I heard a voice. Low, tentative. Thomas. I turned. It was the banker. He glanced toward Charles, then back at me. Could I get your number? There's something we should discuss. I smiled faintly, handed him a card, and stepped out into the cold night air. The frost crunched under my shoes as I walked to my truck. The glow of the Whitmore's perfect holiday dinner fading behind me. I'd walked into their house carrying the truth. I left with something better. Control. By Christmas morning, the Whitmore's perfect image was already starting to fray. I didn't have to hear it from them. I heard it from the town. At 7:15 a.m., I got a text from Jim Callahan, the grocery store owner. Heard you made quite the speech at the Whitmore's dinner last night. Can't say I blame you. Charles has been puffing his chest around here for years. By 9 hands, 2 more messages had come in, both from people I hadn't spoken to in months, each saying some version of, I had no idea. You did all that for them? The thing about a small city like Spokane is that the social hierarchy looks solid until you put a crack in it. Then the whole thing starts shifting under its own weight. I kept to my usual routine that morning. Coffee, newspaper, walk to the shop. The Daily Review was still sitting on the counter from last night, folded to the article they'd used to smear me. I didn't bother throwing it away. I wanted the reminder, not of what they'd said, but of how fast I'd turned it around. When I got to the shop, my old foreman, Mike Torres, was already there, even though I hadn't asked him to work. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, grinning like a man who'd been waiting to hear the story straight from the source. I heard you drop the hammer, he said. Just gave him the truth, I replied. Mike chuckled. Truth's a heavy hammer if you swing it right. The first real sign that my plan had worked came 2 days later. I was at the post office, standing in line behind Mrs. Leary, who'd spent the better part of 40 years chairing every charity committee in the county. She turned, looked me dead in the eye, and said, Thomas, I didn't know. You were very generous to them. Her tone wasn't pity, it was respect. Then she leaned closer. And I'll tell you something. Patricia Morrison's been sniffing around the Whitmores again, but this time it's not for a puff piece. That told me everything I needed to know. In their world, once doubt starts creeping in, it never leaves. By the end of the week, Daniel called. I didn't answer. The voicemail was short, almost sheepish. Dad, we should talk. Things are complicated right now. Of course they were. Charles's power came from perception. The way he could walk into a room and know everyone believed he was the man in charge. But after my little Christmas Eve intervention, people weren't looking at him the same way. They were looking through him, wondering what else he'd kept hidden. One night, just after New Year's, I ran into Margaret at the pharmacy. She was wearing her usual armor, designer coat, hair perfect, but her eyes were tired. "Thomas," she said, forcing a smile, "that stunt you pulled, it was cruel." "Cruel?" I asked. "Margaret, if I wanted to be cruel, I would have brought a lawyer instead of a briefcase." Her smile faltered. "You've embarrassed us." "No," I said evenly. "I've exposed you. That's different." She didn't have an answer for that. By mid-January, the ripple effects were everywhere. Charles was no longer the first man people greeted at Rotary meetings. Invitations that used to arrive weekly at the Whitmore mailbox started to slow. And Patricia Morrison? She printed another piece, this time about the growing issue of financial dependency in multi-generational households. It didn't name the Whitmores directly, but it didn't need to. The timing spoke louder than the text. I'd cracked their facade, and the town was watching it crumble in real time. Then came the unexpected ally. It was a Thursday evening when I got a call from that banker who'd asked for my card on Christmas Eve. His voice was measured, like he was weighing every word. "Thomas," he said, "I think we can help each other. The Whitmores have been in negotiations for a property deal. Let's just say, after what I've learned, I'm not inclined to move forward without full transparency. I'd like to hear more about your experience with them." I could hear the subtext clear as day. The Whitmores' troubles weren't just social anymore, they were starting to bleed into business. And in their world, business was survival. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a glass of bourbon, watching the frost creep along the window. Revenge is a funny thing. People think it's about the big blow, the knockout punch. But real revenge, the kind that lasts, is about erosion. One truth at a time. One doubt at a time, until the foundation isn't there anymore. I hadn't just embarrassed the Whitmores, I'd shifted the ground they stood on, and I wasn't done yet. By February, the Whitmores' downfall was no longer a whisper. It was a topic. Not loud, not scandalous, but the kind of quiet conversation that happens in the corner of the hardware store, in the back pew after Sunday service, at the end of a Chamber of Commerce meeting when people think no one's listening. The banker who'd called me kept in touch. The property deal Charles had been courting for months, dead. The partners didn't want to assume unnecessary risk. Polite code for, "We don't trust you anymore." Rebecca tried calling twice more. I let them both go to voicemail. The first was the same plea as before. "Dad, we should talk." The second was quieter. "I don't know what to say. I didn't think it would get like this." Neither message was an apology. By March, the cracks in their perfect life were visible from the street. The manicured hedges were left untrimmed. The Whitmore lawn and garden sign that had always been placed just so was missing. Then, one morning, I drove past and saw the first sign of surrender. A foreclosure notice taped to their front door. It wasn't joy I felt. It wasn't pity either. It was confirmation. For years, they'd built their lives on the assumption that someone else, me, would absorb the fallout of their choices. Without that safety net, the fall was swift. One night in early April, I was closing up the shop when a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. It was Daniel. He looked older, not in years, but in the way a man looks when the scaffolding holding up his life has been knocked away. "Dad?" he said, voice low. I came to say I was wrong about all of it. I leaned on the counter, studying him. About me? Or about the way you've been living? He hesitated. Both. The old me, the me from 5 years ago, might have taken that as a start, might have looked for a path back. But now? I just nodded. Good. Learn from it. He swallowed hard, nodded back, and left. No handshake, no hug. Some bridges don't burn in a blaze. They just quietly rot until there's nothing left to walk across. By summer, my life was different in ways I hadn't expected. Without the mortgage bleeding my account every month, I started fixing up my place. New paint on the house. A small vegetable garden out back. A dog. A mutt from the shelter. Brown and scruffy, who I named Rusty. I saw friends more. I took short fishing trips. I joined the Tuesday night poker game at the VFW, something I hadn't done in years because there was always one more bill I had to cover for someone else. The more I lived for myself, the more I realized how much of my life I'd been giving away without even noticing. I still heard the occasional update about the Whitmores. They moved into a smaller house across town, rental, not owned. Charles was no longer on the chamber's board. Margaret's invitations to chair charity galas dried up. They weren't ruined. Not completely. People like that rarely are. But they weren't untouchable anymore. And that, in its own way, was justice. One evening in late September, I sat on my porch with Rusty at my feet, the sky going gold over the pines. I thought about how it had started. One decision to stop paying. One refusal to let myself be erased. Revenge hadn't given me my daughter back. It hadn't rebuilt the trust that had been shattered long before the Whitmores planted that article. But it had given me something else, something quieter, steadier, dignity, the kind you don't get from being invited to the right dinners or having the right people nod at you in public. The kind that comes from knowing you didn't let them write your story. I reached down, scratched Rusty's head, and let out a slow breath. The Whitmores could keep their games. I had my life back. And that, I decided, was worth more than any revenge could ever buy. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to leave us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you.